call to arms by the Confederacy at the start of the American Civil War in 1861 was heard far and wide. Southerners, with a sense of civic responsibility from a spectrum of backgrounds, left their homes, their businesses, and their families to defend the South's way of life. I'm Nick Poulin, and today we're going to take a closer look at the uniforms of a prominent Southern businessman who heard the call and fought bravely throughout the Civil War. Captain Cuthbert Slocomb was a senior partner at a business in New Orleans, Slocomb, Baldwin and Company, before the start of the Civil War. He was from a well-to-do family, whose combined wealth was estimated to be over $1 million. This was a massive sum for the antebellum South. It was May of 1861 when Slocomb joined the Confederate forces as a lieutenant in 2nd Company of the Washington Artillery of New Orleans. 2nd Company first saw action with the Army of Northern Virginia at the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Battle of Manassas. The Battle of Manassas was the first major battle between the North and South armies. When the companies of Washington Artillery arrived in Manassas, they discovered an unfortunate problem. Their uniforms were navy blue. To avoid any disastrous confusion with the seemingly similar Union uniforms, the men of the Washington Artillery tied a red flannel over their left arm. At the start of the battle, as the Yankees approached, General Beauregard sent 3 divisions of men to meet the oncoming forces. The Union forces pushed back against Beauregard's men. As the Confederates were driven back, they fell back on Henry Hill, where General Thomas Jackson had centered his artillery and infantry. The Union forces approached the left flank, and Jackson's forces drove them back. It was then that Thomas Jackson's men struck out and pushed the Union forces back, forcing them into a retreat. This was where Thomas Jackson earned the name Stonewall. There were elements from Louisiana that fought on the northern front, as well as pushing the southern flank. General Beauregard was so impressed with the men of the Washington Artillery that he presented them with his battle flag after the end of the Civil War. After the victory of Manassas, the men of the Washington Artillery were issued new Confederate gray uniforms. In the winter of 1861, Slocomb returned to New Orleans, where he resigned from 2nd Company in order to join 5th Company. It did not take Slocomb long to be promoted. By early 1862, he rose to the rank of captain of 5th Company. 5th Company first saw action at the Battle of Shiloh, fighting alongside the 4th and 13th Louisiana Infantry. During the first day, the 4th and 13th Louisiana Infantry pushed the center of the lines, forcing the Union generals to fall back. At the start of the second day, the 4th Louisiana was positioned just northwest of Shiloh Church. The Union forces attacked. General Grant's men now outnumbered Beauregard's Confederate forces. Beauregard pushed back with a counterattack. However, the Union reinforcements soon overwhelmed the Confederates and drove them back to Corinth. During this intense back-and-forth battle, Captain Slocomb was shot through the chest. When inspecting his gray uniform coat that he wore in the battle, you'll find a blood-stained bullet hole where the round ripped through his body. When Slocomb recovered, he rejoined his unit and fought at the Battle of Perryville in fall of 1862. He was quite possibly wearing this gray uniform coat at the Battle of Perryville as well. The battle began with a cavalry skirmish. When the Confederate infantry arrived, the fighting centralized on Peters Hill. At the start of the second day, the Union forces advanced, stopping just shy of the Confederate line. The fighting paused till around noon, when the Confederate forces crashed into the left flank and drove the Union back. The Union forces eventually stopped the Confederate advance and pushed them back into Perryville, where they fought in the streets until General Bragg slipped away in the darkness. In January of 1863, Captain Slocomb's company was commanded by Brigadier General Randall Lee Gibson in the Army of Tennessee. Gibson's forces drove against the eastern flank, pushing the Union forces back. However, the Union artillery let loose on the Confederate advance, stopping it in its tracks. The Confederates withdrew, suffering major casualties, losing approximately 35% of their men. Slocomb and his men would next see action at the Battle of Chickamauga, one of the bloodiest battles on the western front of the Civil War. The ferocious battle began with a cavalry skirmish against the Union's Lightning Brigade, armed with Spencer repeating carbines. The Union held the advance until the following day. In the morning, General Bragg pushed the left flank. In the heat of the battle, General Rosecrans misidentifies a hole in his lines and pulls his men out of position, allowing an opportunity for Bragg's men to advance and drive the general into retreat. George Thomas assumed command of the remaining Union forces and took position on Horseshoe Ridge and Snodgrass Hill. the advancing Confederate forces rout the remaining Union men in the hills and drive them back to Chattanooga. Slocomb, as a member of Bragg's forces, likely pursued Rosecrans' men and lay siege on the Union forces. It was not until November of 1863 that the Union forces would take the offensive. At Missionary Ridge, Slocomb's company was positioned on a hill, looking down on Union Major General Sherman's men. Sherman attacked into the Confederate lines, and Slocomb was forced to retreat alongside the Confederate army. Slocomb would next battle the Union forces at Resaca, where he was likely positioned on the second line of the northern flank. Hood orders the Confederate forces to attack on both flanks. The Confederate forces were unable to budge the Union. At the end of Union General Sherman's Atlanta campaign, at the Battle of Jonesboro, Slocomb would again be wounded. It was during a lull in the fighting. He approached a group of his fellow soldiers with a cone of cornbread and exclaimed, "Boys, I'll divide." At that very moment, he was struck in the shoulder, spun around, but stayed on his feet. His men rushed him to the medical tents, and he would go on to later recover in a South Carolina hospital. He was again wearing the gray uniform coat when struck by the second bullet. It is evident from the blood-stained bullet hole that can be found in the shoulder. Once he recovered from his wounds, he returned to his company, where he fought alongside them at the Battle of Spanish Fort and also in Mobile, Alabama. He would go on to stay with his company until the end of the war, when the Confederates surrendered in 1865. Fast forwarding to 1950, the uniforms surfaced at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, Illinois. They were discovered by pioneer collector George Markham. We are all temporary custodians when we find incredible treasures such as these, and Markham was no different. In 1987, he presented the uniforms to a young Confederate artillery reenactor, Don Polifka. During Don Polifka's extensive research attempting to identify who these uniforms belonged to, he enlisted the help of Les Jensen from the Museum of the Confederacy. During Les's review, it was determined that all of these uniforms belonged to the same Louisiana artillery captain. It was then discovered, on the inside of one of the hang loops, the name C.H. Slocomb. After additional research, it was discovered that this could only be one person of the same name and rank. Captain Cuthbert Harrison Slocomb, 5th Company, Washington Artillery of New Orleans. But how did the uniforms end up at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, Illinois? Let's take a closer look at the family history after the Civil War. Slocomb died in 1873. His daughter Cora Ann married an Italian diplomat and moved to an area outside of Venice. His widow accompanied her to Europe. In 1897, his daughter returned to the States and lectured in Chicago, Illinois for the International Peace Arbitration Movement. Slocomb's widow would eventually pass away in Zurich in 1917. His daughter would live until 1944, where she passed away in Rome. There was one mention of Slocomb's effects after the war. In 1932, his granddaughter traveled to Louisiana and wrote in a letter that during a polo match she wore grandfather's insignia. Slocomb's larger military effects may not have traveled to Europe with his widow and his daughter. They possibly may have stayed in Louisiana with one of his 2 sisters. Of his 2 sisters, only one had children. Slocomb's great niece, Anne Phoebe Potter, would live in Chicago, Illinois from the 1930s to the 1950s. The Abraham Lincoln Bookstore opened in the 1930s. There's a very strong possibility that these uniforms were carried through the family until they were discovered by Markham at the Abraham Lincoln Bookstore in the 1950s. I'd like to take a second to thank Don and Judy Polifka for the incredible opportunity to share these uniforms with you. If it wasn't for their extensive research and preservation, that would not be possible. I'd like to also thank Steve Sylvia and Nancy Rosebacher of North-South Trader Publication for their extensive research and investigation into the uniforms of Captain Cuthbert H. Slocomb. Thank you for watching. If you like this video and want to learn more about historic Civil War relics, like this Major General's uniform that belonged to Confederate General Martin Luther Smith, or this 7th Texas battle flag with battle honors, then visit our website at poulinauctions.com. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, stay safe, and send it downrange.